Oh, what a Joseph is this! What a son is this! He pleased two fathers eminently. But you know what always follows blessing? No matter what adversity to which God brings a man, and through His grace brings him forth gloriously in that place, and just when he's beginning to taste the joy and the delight of having risen from it, comes a greater temptation than the first pit. Because Potiphar had a wife, and though he had left all things in Joseph's charge, it says that after a time his master's wife, in the 7th verse, cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Come, lie with me." I don't know quite how to express this. And this, I don't think, is just unique to red-blooded Jewish boys. I think it's common to us all that we are going to face a severity of temptation in this hour that would chill us if we could imagine it. How many of you are conscious and aware of the kinds of satanic inspiration that are going on in our culture and our civilization? Have you ever seen anything more fiendish as present fashions for women? Have you realized that the kinds of things which we accept as commonplace would have shocked a generation a decade or so ago? That women are respectably clothed today with such revelation of their forms that it doesn't take much inspired imagination. And yet it's commonplace and happenstance, and we hardly blink an eyelash. That there seems to be a confluence, a coming together of ingenious design and new fabrics to aid it. And I could just talk about fashion. What shall we say of films? What shall we say of the media? What shall we say of TV? What shall we say of advertising? What shall we say of the very air that we breathe, that is becoming increasingly charged with the spirit of Potiphar's wife? The seductive world, has it ever been groovier? Has it ever been more powerful? Has merchandise ever had a greater power to snare the souls of men than it has now? Has packaging ever been so brilliantly exploited? Have men ever learned to stock their shelves with such acuity and sophistication as they now do in our supermarkets, where they have studied color and sound in such combination that you are virtually a victim when you go in for a mere toothbrush and come out with your shopping basket littered with goods? There's power and extraordinary temptation and devilish ingenuity in everything that is earthly and sensual and worldly, and we're only at a beginning. Come lie with me. Can you imagine this woman, an Egyptian, the very symbol of everything that is voluptuous and seductive? Some heavy-bosomed dame, gloriously built, palpitating, made up, fragrant, and a Jewish man who has been denied the kinds of things that men take for granted as their right, because he's known nothing but pits and exile from youth on. You know what such a one might be tempted to say? I got it coming. I'm only flesh and blood. I'm only human. How many times have we said that for much less a temptation than what Joseph had to suffer in this moment? You say, Katz, you use the word suffering liberally. Well, I want to read you Hebrews 2:18. For in that he himself suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. For in that he himself suffered being tempted. May I say this? Temptation is suffering. And any red-blooded boy who can refuse such an invitation as this has got to rush out at the back door of the porch and puke. Because every corpuscle and every cell in his body, everything that's flesh is crying for gratification and for delight. To resist such temptation as this is suffering. Temptation is suffering, folks. And how many of us have built up a capacity to endure suffering? What's the threshold of your capacity to endure suffering? At what point will you break? At what point will you throw in the towel? At what point would you surrender? It's interesting that it says in the 10th verse, and she spoke to Joseph day after day. You know, we might screw up our courage and purse our lips and grit our teeth and get by a single temptation. But what are you going to do when it's pushed into your face day after day? This is going to be more than a momentary courage and a momentary resolution. There has got to be something wrought in our character that enables us to endure persistent, claimant, strident, siren, seductive voices like this, or we shall collapse. You know what I could say about such a man? He's not made in a day. It may take many going down into Egypt before we're ready for temptations of this proportion. Joseph is an end-time message for this reason only, because in it we have a pattern of what must invariably come to the son who is to be the overcomer at the end of the age. Such men must be brought down, not by the hand of the Ishmaelites or by brethren who despise them, but by a God who is preparing them. Are you willing to be such a one? Oh, I know that there are many groovy schools of discipleship in our generation, and in 3 months they'll fit you for service. And you can go off and save Afghanistan. But we're speaking about a son who spent 13 years in confinements in pits and dungeons and cells. The same number of years that a Paul spent in Arabia, and the same number of years, interestingly enough, that a Richard Wurmbrand spent in communist prison camps. How many have heard of him? For some reason today, I was reminded of something that he spoke in one of his books, Tortured for Christ, I think it is, where he said that he came to a point where he watched men belabor his body as if he were looking disinterestedly upon another and not himself. His spirit was apart from what was taking place, and he was looking down on men whacking flesh, but he did not feel the sting of their blows. Somehow he had come to a place where his life was no longer lived in his body. How many of us would go pale if someone approached us with a hypodermic needle and the idea of something going to penetrate our flesh? I haven't forgotten my Army experiences when we walked down a corridor and there were the male nurses with their hypos giving it to us on both arms as we went down a row. And I remember men with their chests heavy with ribbons from campaigns of every kind, keeling over in a faint when they saw the needles poised for their flesh. Where is your life being lived tonight? You who are a product of a generation that has so pampered flesh that you cannot believe it. More to do with bodily creature comfort than any generation that has ever preceded it. Men with their hairdos and their styles. As I had to tell a brother in ministry who wanted to join me in a trip to Eastern Europe, I cannot take you, brother. I love you, you're a dear brother, you're precious, but I cannot take you because if my Eastern European brethren catch one glimpse of your hair dryer, we're finished. In which direction are we moving, and how are we preparing ourselves for the eventualities of the end time? I don't think there's any more precious statement in all the Scripture in the response to the temptation, "Come, lie with me," than the answer of Joseph. 3 beautiful words. But he refused. he refused.